Hello and welcome to New York One's Off Topic on Politics. I'm New York One State House reporter Zach Fink. Now that the race for mayor has entered its final stretch, we want to spend some time talking about the two main candidates, Eric Adams and Curtis Sliwa. We all know that they have very different styles, but what are they actually proposing to improve in terms of the lives of New Yorkers? We'll discuss. And as Hispanic Heritage Month comes to an end, we analyze why a community that has been steadily growing hasn't been able to gain much ground in citywide politics. Here with me for all of it is the host of Pura Politica on NY1 Noticias, Juan Manuel Benitez. How you doing, Juan?
Hey, Zach. We do have an election, and I didn't even remember that we have an election in November, right?
It did kind of sneak up on us. And New York One political director, Bob Hart. How you doing, Bob?
Hey, greetings from a conference room hidden away in New York One.
I recognized your background right away. I said, I know that place. We are taping over Zoom on Thursday morning. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the mayor's race. I'm joking it snuck up on us because it's, in just a few weeks away, but I feel like the governor's race kind of overtook everything just in terms of excitement and things were happening. But that's a ways off compared to the mayoral election, which is early next month. There was an article as a jumping off point that I just saw in the New York Times this week about how Eric Adams is keeping kind of a low profile, not necessarily giving advisories for events that he's doing, certainly not the frenetic schedule he was keeping heading into the primary when there were multiple candidates and they each needed to distinguish themselves. So let me throw to each of you. I mean, is Adams doing kind of a Rose Garden strategy, even though he's not even the mayor yet, where kind of like, hey, this is inevitable. I'm not going to put myself out there. I'm not going to. Certainly he has a history of opening his mouth and saying, impolitic things that can get him in trouble, right?
In this podcast, I think we are all for democracy and the democratic process and for elections and people participating. But we have to be honest. Most New Yorkers took the primary election as the main event this year for mayor. And now they are like, we're telling them, hey, you still have to go to the polls once again to either confirm what we think is going to happen, that is Eric Adams will become the next mayor, or to pick someone else. Among them, the Republican nominee for mayor, Curtis Sliwa. So having said that, obviously, if you are the front runner and you are the assumed or presumed next mayor of the city, you're going to try not to do too much, not to be out there unnecessarily in front of the cameras, so you can minimize any mistakes that might be overplayed in the media in the next few days. Let's remember that in a little over a week, we're going to start the early voting process. And so far, Eric Adams is the front runner, presumed next mayor, and he is taking time, maybe creating the coalitions when it comes to business, when it comes to politics, that are going to help him govern starting next year.
Yeah, if this were a football game, Eric Adams would have a huge lead and would be trying to run out the clock. And that's essentially what he's doing right here. But we should remind everyone that there are plenty of historical recent examples of Republicans winning in the general election. John Lindsay, obviously, Rudy Giuliani, Michael Bloomberg. The last two elections, the two Republican nominees didn't get 30%. And I think this is the road that this election is traveling down. I don't see a Lindsay. I don't see a Bloomberg. I don't see a Giuliani. Special things have to happen for a Republican to win in New York. And nothing special is happening so far for Curtis Sliwa.
And what about Curtis Sliwa? I mean, this is a guy who is known for drawing attention to himself. He's very adept at, I don't even mean that in a negative way. I mean, like, he's very adept at, generating media coverage, drawing attention to what he's trying to do. And yet even still, I feel like he has had trouble gaining that level of attention that he would need in order to draw real interest in his campaign. And I say that with the backdrop that Adams has been doing so little himself, right? He hasn't been out there every day, and yet still Sliwa is having difficulty breaking through.
I mean, Sliwa is a master of public relations and media, but there just doesn't seem to be a two-way street going with a lot of the political media. I think you're right. Adams is trying to run out the clock. Sliwa is trying his best. But I just don't, it's going to take a lot of traction, these two debates that they have, for Sliwa to make up some ground.
Sliwa would be talking to Republican voters, right? If he wanted to win the election, and also beyond the Republican constituency in New York, if he wanted to go beyond the 50% needed to win the election, or the percentage, whatever the percentage needed to have a plurality of the votes. However, let's remember that many Republican voters in New York City switched their party registrations early this year so they could participate in the Democratic primary because they believed that was the election that mattered this year. Even Joe Lhota, who was a Republican nominee for mayor in 2013, is now a Democrat. So he registered as a Democrat. And remember that the result that we got in the Democratic primary for mayor was a combination of not only Democrats and progressives and maybe Democratic socialists, but also Republicans and centrists. And that's why Eric Adams, with that message that is might be to many Democrats a little bit too conservative, that's why he won the primary.
Yeah, I mean, you need a three-way race, which is what John Lindsay had, or you need a big defection. You need to win all the Republicans, most of the non-affiliates, and then a smattering of the Democrats. That's the recipe for success. And that's a tough recipe to make for a Republican.
And what about the messaging, right? I mean, there is something to be said here that, Adams already has the mantle of public safety, which, right, would normally be the lane that the Republican would eke out here. But in this case, Sliwa was saying, I'm going to do more public safety, right? Over the guy, trying to shout over the guy who won on an issue of public safety.
You nailed it. I mean, Curtis Sliwa's biggest accomplishment is, hey, I ran a vigilante crime fighting group. Eric Adams' biggest accomplishment before being a lawmaker was, hey, I was a police captain, I was a reformer. So who are you going to trust? And that's Sliwa's greatest thing is that that's the kryptonite for Curtis Sliwa is you have super Eric Adams, wearing the cape.
Not only that, I think Eric Adams is trying to appeal to New Yorkers in a way that Bloomberg did back in the day. He's trying to push a pro-business message that many New Yorkers missed during the de Blasio mayoralty. And de Blasio wasn't as friendly to the business community as many New Yorkers would like. And now Eric Adams is saying to New Yorkers, listen, I'm going to be the next Bloomberg in a way in that regard, and also still be a Democrat in many other aspects.
He's sort of a political chameleon, right? Because he can appeal that way, but he can say also, I'll be almost making history again as the second Black mayor. He can appeal to so many different groups, and he's sort of squishy. And maybe that's why we're not seeing him on the campaign trail. Is being squishy is great in a general election when you can be all things to all people.
Yeah, and in terms of the business community, right, Eric Adams has had that from the get-go. I mean, right, the day after the primary, right, didn't he photograph himself at Rouse with John Katsimatidis and other Republicans? So right away, he tacked right. We always hear about tacking left in this city to win over the constituency, but he immediately kind of, ate up that space too, and saying hey, listen, I'm the law and order guy and I'm the business guy. You got nowhere else to go.
And if you're a lefty, you're not going to suddenly vote for Curtis Sliwa. It's Adams' way or the highway. So, I mean, that's the secret of Adams' success. What are you going to do?
And I was just going to ask about Sliwa. I mean, two things. Number one, is there a way for him to break through? Clearly, we're getting late in the game here, and it's becoming less and less likely. And then I have to throw this out there. I mean, has Sliwa gotten to the point where we've seen too much Sliwa, and he turns the debate into the Sliwa show, and he wears silly outfits, and he does these publicity stunts? I mean, have people sort of seen him and said, I reject that right now, that we're in a serious crisis here?
His hope would be very low turnout, a disastrous pair of debate performances by Eric Adams, and Adams sort of sleepwalks into the general election. That's his only hope, and that you get an elevated turnout on Staten Island where there's a lot of competitive races. I'm coming up with a dream scenario for Curtis Sliwa. I mean, stranger things have happened. Ask Byron Brown, the mayor of Buffalo, who's about to be unemployed probably, how you can lose. That's what you need is low turnout, bad debate performance, and Adams just sort of mailing it in between now and Election Day.
Sliwa, no matter what we could think about him, he's a really smart guy. So he's going to have to make that decision going into the debates. Does he want to just be a showman, or does he want to really, try to have a real shot at this? That we don't see it right now. We don't see a path for him to victory. So I'm sure Bob will have a better view of this, an opinion of this, because Bob, like Curtis Sliwa, was an employee of New York One, or a contributor to New York One, and you had to oversee some of his appearances, right, when he gave a commentary.
I mean, he's incredibly knowledgeable about New York City. He's been part of the city's culture and history, for more than 40 years, almost 50 years. And so I think sometimes what we would see, even when he was on New York One, is the shtick would greatly eclipse substance. So for him to have a strong debate showing, he needs to appear serious. And sort of to your point, Zach, which is like, hey, is this guy a clown? Like, no, this guy's not a clown. He needs to be a serious politician, a serious debater. And if he can do that, maybe he can get beyond the 30%, which the last two Republicans were failed to achieve. But it's just very, very tough right now, given the political climate in New York City.
Yeah, and the Republican Party has been so diminished. I mean, it's almost like finding someone to even carry the torch there, right? I mean, in New York City, there are so few people who can actually do, because we've really sort of splintered into Democrat and more radical Democrat, in terms of the electorate.
You're exactly right. I think there's more than a dozen city council races where the Republicans didn't even field a candidate, which is just bad for democracy. You can be far to the right, far to the left, but if we're living in a one-party city or one-party state or one-party country, you're in trouble. And the Republican Party in New York City, you could extend this nationally, but I'd say in the city has done a very bad job at reaching out to immigrants of every ideological stripe. To think that all immigrants that come to New York City are to the left, Juan can attest to this, is crazy. And I just think the outreach, the idea is that, we're just going to go primarily for older white conservative people, is a losing recipe demographically in New York City.
I've said this many times before. It feels sometimes in New York that we are a one-party city. This feels like communist Cuba sometimes. On the other hand, voters are going to see in their ballots, they're going to see different names for mayors and minor party candidates. I interviewed one of them last week, Raja Flores. He's a Cuban-American surgeon at Mount Sinai. So voters are going to have the option to pick someone else if they want to. They just need to do some research, and the Board of Elections and all the organizations that work in elections in the city, they are providing voters with information so they can make a final informed decision before filling out their ballots.
And the Republican Party nationally, of course, as it's gotten more radical, has gone away from exactly what you're saying, Bob. The Republican Party would have to do locally in a place like New York City, right? Like they would have to go in the opposite direction, kind of broaden the tent, appeal to a more diverse electorate and base. And the National Party has gone completely, away from that, which makes it harder and harder for a local party to organize without those resources and without that support.
Yeah, it's one thing when you're in Texas and you can gerrymander House congressional districts and legislative districts. It's another thing when you're in an overwhelmingly Democratic New York City. And that's, we could have a whole podcast on the future of the Republican Party, which would be fascinating, but nationally. But locally, it's just kind of insane to me. It wasn't that long ago that you had a vibrant Republican Party in Manhattan and in other places, and they're really, really struggling outside of Staten Island.
All right, let's leave it there for now. When we come back, we are going to discuss the Hispanic and Latino power in this city and what has happened to it. And Juan has a lot of perspective on this, and I'm looking forward to hearing it. Stay with us.
New York business owners, if you're getting internet service from Verizon, you're paying too much. Switch to Spectrum Business and get New York City's best offer. Blazing fast internet speeds of 600 megabits per second for just $49.99 per month. And phone for just $19.99 a month. Taxes and fees included. Plus, Spectrum Business has over 99.9% network reliability. Switch to Spectrum Business. Call 855-234-2249. Restrictions apply. Call for details.
Your New York One team is your reliable source for local and in-depth political coverage at home or on the go. Head to the Spectrum News app to stay up to date on the issues that matter to you and your community. Spectrum News, your community connection. Available on the App Store and Google Play.
All right, as we draw to a close on Hispanic Heritage Month, a lot to discuss here in terms of the alignment of political power in this city. I certainly have some thoughts on this. I know Bob does too, but let me start with you, Juan, because I think this is a really good discussion to have just in terms of, where things stand in terms of political power here in the city.
I mean, I would say to start that I didn't invent ethnic politics, right? The history of New York City politics is a history of different racial and ethnic groups trying to get to positions of power. Now, when you look at the census numbers, the latest census numbers, they are telling us that 29% of New Yorkers are Hispanic. 29%. However, we have never had a Hispanic comptroller, public advocate, or mayor of the city of New York. And why is that? So the assignment that Bob gave me for the story that I filed this past week for New York One was, why is that? Let's try to explain why there hasn't been a citywide elected Latino. And it's complicated, right? Like everything when it comes to politics and ethnic politics. And one of the reasons I would say is because the more the Hispanic population or Latino population grows, the more complex it gets, right? And I spoke to State Senator Jessica Ramos. She is Colombian American. And she said, listen, we are extremely different from each other. So sometimes we're not going to be in agreement.
We think differently, we worship differently, we love differently, we identify differently. There are Afro-Latinos, like there are Indigenous Latinos, like there are white Latinos, and everything in between.
I think that's Latinos are sometimes spoken about as a monolith, and they're not. They're extraordinarily diverse, ethnically, racially, politically. And I think as new immigrant groups come from different Spanish-speaking countries, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think there was a very large Puerto Rican population for a long time, but that has been kind of, diluted with other people who are coming from different parts of the world. And I think if you compare it to, another minority in the city, African Americans come from a very different history. They were not immigrants. They were brought here in bondage, and they learned over a period of decades to organize through churches, through civil rights leaders, how to use the ballot box to advance the cause for their people, and have done so really successfully. And you really see that in New York today, where you have, the leading candidate for mayor is African American, both legislative leaders, statewide, those are statewide positions, even though they're not elected statewide. The attorney general is elected statewide. She's African American. I mean, that is, 4 years ago, it was all white people, so it really does speak to the fact, number one, that change came over a very long period of time, and now it does seem to be happening suddenly, but it certainly was not a sudden development. And number two, achieving that power is possible with organizing and with, trying to elect someone who is Spanish speaking. It can be done, but I think the myriad reasons you said are complex and maybe have prevented that.
I mean, there's always a lag time, if you look at the history of New York City, between groups, the strength of a group population-wise and the strength of that group politically. When you had all the Irish come, you didn't suddenly have an Irish mayor or an Irish police commissioner. And that's also part of it. But I mean, Juan, you and Bobby Cusa, both of you, I think, sort of did bookends of great portraits of the community in New York City. A, how huge it is, but B, how diverse it is, and also diverse geographically. The Hispanic population in Washington Heights went down and went down in Williamsburg. It's very, places where it's still very high. But it's just interesting. The portrait is really changing, where, like you said, Zach, used to be Puerto Rican. Well, now it's Dominican, then Puerto Rican, and then you go way down and it's Mexican and Ecuadorian. All different cultures, all different histories, all different experiences. That makes it difficult. But that being said, I think it's just a matter of time that you're going to have a Latino mayor. I mean, you've been hearing this for more than a generation. Freddie Ferrer, like you pointed out in your piece, Juan, was expected to be like the first Latino mayor, and for various reasons didn't happen. I think it will happen, but it's sort of fascinating to me. Like, just like we haven't had a woman mayor yet, we haven't had a Latino mayor either.
I've been covering Latino politics for the last 2 decades, right, in New York, and I was extremely shocked last month when there was an opening for lieutenant governor in the state, and knowing that the state controller is Tom DiNapoli and the state attorney general is Letitia James, and now we have the first woman governor of the state of New York, a white woman, I thought, you know what? Now all the Latino elected officials in Albany are going to flex some muscle, and they're going to demand that Kathy Hochul elects or appoints a Latino lieutenant governor. But that didn't happen. I spoke to many Albany lawmakers of Latino descent, and they weren't organizing. They weren't trying to form any coalition to push Kathy Hochul to make history in that regard. So I was extremely surprised because, again, I started Pura Politica 16 years ago when Freddie Ferrer was supposed to become the first Latino mayor of the city back in 2005, and he lost to Michael Bloomberg. And since then, we haven't seen any kind of Latino official that could create that strong coalition of Latinos and beyond Latinos to really propel that person to citywide office. I would say, though, that this year we had in the Democratic field 2 Latino candidates for mayor. We had Diane Morales and we had Carlos Menchaca. They weren't able to really galvanize that Latino power coalition to really win the primary. And I spoke to a political consultant, Camille Rivera from New Deal Strategies, and she told me something that I've been seeing recently a lot, that it might not be that much about, hey, we're all Latinos at this point. It's more about, hey, do we share an ideology?
We weren't able to galvanize, I think, ideologies, and the split in ideologies, progressive versus non-progressive, very much clouded the ability for many of us to coalesce around a candidate that could lift up the voices of so many across the city.
Hey, Juan, or maybe Zach knows this better. Wasn't Hochul, didn't she supposedly reach out first to Ruben Diaz, the outgoing Bronx Borough president, to be lieutenant governor, and he said no? That was the story I read somewhere.
That was the story, which I did not verify, or at least they wouldn't confirm it. But there were at least 3 people we know in the mix, and he was one of them. Jamal Bailey being the other one, another state senator. So there was a short list, and Ruben Diaz Jr. was certainly on it. And I would say, just regarding Albany, there is a pretty sizable Latino representation in Albany when it comes to the Senate and the Assembly. I think, that's important to include in all of this. I mean, it's primarily downstate in the city, absolutely, and from neighborhoods that are primarily Spanish speaking. But, in terms of getting to that next level that you're talking about, Juan, which is, a citywide or a statewide, it's been surprisingly lacking. And I would even argue there's no shortage of candidates in the city council, assembly, Senate who could presumably do that, right? I mean, who are certainly people I could picture in some of those roles.
Bob, I would like for you to remember, right? When it comes to Black power, political power in the city, we have the big 4, right? And help me with this, David Dinkins, Percy Sutton, Charlie Rangel, and Basil Patterson, right? Mm-hmm. Am I correct? And so
the Gang of 4.
The Gang of 4, they were instrumental in getting African-American politicians elected to office and to positions of power, right? And we saw something similar for a long time, maybe in the Bronx. Jose Rivera, the assemblyman who was elected in 1982 for the first time, he's still in the assembly. And he was the Bronx Democratic County leader for a long time. And him and Roberto Ramirez, former assemblyman, and Luis Miranda, a political consultant and lobbyist, they tried to really nurture Latino elected officials to propel them, to get them to higher office and citywide office. And one of those promising officials was Ruben Diaz Jr., the Bronx Borough president, who's been in office for almost 25 years. Well, that generation of Ruben Diaz Jr. and some other elected officials like him, now they are retiring. They're leaving politics entirely. So they are creating some sort of vacuum. Now you have the newbies, the new Latinos coming into office that are growing and growing in Albany and also in the city council. We might have 15 Latino members of the city council next year, but there's no bench right now when it comes to elected officials who've been in office for some time and could really put on like a run for citywide office, a serious one that could have some victory in the near future.
But if you look to your earlier point, Juan, I think it's really valid. The most famous, probably nationally, Hispanic politician is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, right? I mean, she's like huge, the most followed person, I think, in the House after Nancy Pelosi. But she doesn't, I'd say that her identity is more of her ideology first than her ethnicity. That didn't used to be the case in earlier generations of politicians. She's a leftist who happens to be Latina, not a Latina who's a leftist. And that's a big difference.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I also think in terms of Ruben Diaz Jr., I mean, he was the guy, right? I mean, there was a strong belief there for a while that the next mayor would be him. He would be the first, Latino mayor. That was and he decided to walk away from it. So, I think that took the wind out of a lot of people's sails. I mean, looking ahead, I know that there's some chatter about, the Brooklyn District Attorney, Eric Gonzalez, possibly running for Attorney General if Letitia James were to run for governor. That's another possibility of a high profile candidate. And I would also just say, just for some perspective, there are other ethnic minorities in this city who are grossly underrepresented. I mean, Asians, for example, are the fastest growing population in the city, and they are grossly underrepresented in both Albany and in the city council, but especially in Albany. South Asians as well, they're a growing population. So it's to your point, Bob, it takes a long time in some cases, and it doesn't happen instantaneously, and there are a lot of reasons for it, and it's not necessarily an easy to prescribe in terms of what the reason is.
I would add two more things. Number one, the Bronx used to be that place where Latino power was extremely influential and pushing other Latinos for elected office. Now, for the first time in decades, the Bronx is going to have a non-Latino as Bronx Borough president. Most likely is going to be Vanessa Gibson, who is African American. And they don't have a Latino Bronx Democratic chair. The only Latino borough president that the city most likely is going to have starting next year is the Brooklyn Borough president. Antonio Reynoso, the councilman, is expected to be the next Brooklyn Borough president. And I would say also, and I think, and this is extremely important, we're seeing a fragmentation, a division when it comes to political or elected officials trying to get together because they are all Latino, Hispanic, or as they want to call themselves, some of them, the newer generation now, Latinx. And that's a topic for a different discussion, and intersectionality and all those things. But redistricting is coming. And when it comes to district lines, those decisions in many ways, many times, they are made based on racial and ethnic lines to give different races and ethnicities a voice in the political process. If Latinos in the state of New York are not united in one front, they might be losing power when it comes to that extremely crucial process that happens every 10 years.
Democrats are going to draw them themselves anyway, so hopefully everyone will have a seat at the table. All right, that's going to do it for this week's episode. Find all of us on Twitter or send us an email at yourstoryny1@charter.com. You can subscribe to Off Topic wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like what you're hearing, leave a review. Special thanks to our producer, Monica Espedia. Be safe. We'll see you soon.